Hello and welcome to Season 5, Episode 4 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop. Happy Easter.
Yes, happy Easter. We're recording this on Easter
Live
Sunday.
and in person.
Nope, that's not how podcasts work. It is not live. It's live for us, but the people listening are not listening to this live.
We're recording it live and in person.
Yes, well, that's how every recording works. But
no, we can dub you in.
well, no, I don't think that's how that works. Because
never mind. Anyway.
Never mind. We are, of course, reading Tolkien Dogmatics, Theology Through Mythology with the Maker of Middle-earth by Austin Freeman. A great book. I've really been enjoying it. And this time we are talking about creation and what are Tolkien's thoughts on creation, God as a creator, and also humans as sub-creators and things like that. A very interesting chapter. I think that really gets more into Tolkien's beliefs than I think the past couple chapters, rather than sort of surmising or just drawing on Roman Catholicism in general, really getting into what Tolkien thinks here. But you might disagree.
No, I would tend to agree, and I think what I think we should do, maybe kind of have more of a plan of when you have like the chapter and then the subtopics as organized in the book. Very well written, good read. Maybe I could summarize, or we could summarize Tolkien's belief. Then we can talk about if you have an opinion as to whether or not the book summary of Tolkien's beliefs and writings are accurate, and then we can talk maybe generally about those beliefs and whether we think that he's right or wrong or something.
Sure.
Maybe that'd be a little bit more focused. Wrestling with this book, trying to figure out, how we going to kind of format this in our podcast, different than what we've done before, because usually we just summarize what a philosopher, what the idea was for each chapter, and then we just do commentary of what our beliefs are. And this is a little bit different because it's really a story about, or a book about the beliefs of Tolkien, and then then we can talk about whether we agree with the author and his description of Tolkien's, and then after that, whether we agree with the beliefs of Tolkien, which I suspect that we probably will.
Yeah, I mean, as Catholics, I'm sure.
Anyway, so do you want to plow right into it, or do you want to tell us how much you enjoyed this chapter?
No, we could just plow right into it, I think.
Did you enjoy the
chapter?
chapter?
Yeah, no, I did enjoy the chapter, of course.
So this chapter is about creation, which I thought was just going to be like one... God created the world or whatever, but there's that, and the author does a good job of breaking down the subparts of, what a philosophy of the creation would be. And he initially starts talking about that essentially Tolkien's doctrine of creation is almost inseparable from his doctrine of humanity and fall, meaning that we're creations, but we had a fall from grace, that type of thing, as far as I understand it. And then he views humans as some sort of creators. That God created everything, but then He created us to create other things within this theological world. And the idea of a fallen yet noble drive towards creation and creativity undergirds Tolkien's philosophy, and that's what the author is asserting with regard to his general creative thought, his general thoughts of creation, and not only like who created the world, but also creating things within the world, and so that we're fallen, we're all sinners, that type of thing, and then we're using our creative abilities in some sense to try to fulfill God's plan, really, and get back to salvation. So would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. That's a good summary of Tolkien's overall beliefs. And we'll get into that more with sort of the sub-creation idea. But that's probably one of my favorite parts about Tolkien is his ideas about sub-creation. We talked about that a little bit with Revelation and things like that, right, and how you're sort of inspired to create things. But no, it's a great topic and one of the things I love most about Tolkien.
Now, the least interesting part of this book was this next section, which is a discussion of creation from nothing. And it's kind of like just a general philosophical thought of that God creates, natural law, which means the laws of nature, and a moral law inherent in the universe, like what is good or what is bad, and this is how the world works. And now I did have a question. I think you've explained this to me before. That
the Ainulindale.
The Song of the Angels. Is that the creation song?
Yes, that's like the story of creation.
All right. And so then there's a long discussion in here about about whether or not, I don't know if it's in this section of the book, whether or not Tolkien's fictional God was the complete creator, or he created the angels that created the world through this song, and thus being the sub creators. And I think Tolkien, according to the author, came down on, well, those sub creators, those angels in the songs, were really just Tolkien's creation, and they were doing they're not Tolkien, the God's creation. It's the whatever the Eru or whatever his fictional God was. But then there's a discussion later, and maybe I'm skipping ahead, about, well, there's kind of like the Satan character trying to compromise the song, the creation song, through some sort of chaotic intercession in the song. But then they were able to overcome that and incorporate that, which gets into his theories about even bad things are part of God's plan and part of God's creation. Am I summarizing that right? You look at me like you're watching paint dry.
No, I think that's right, because what you're talking about here is, essentially the angels, or the Ainur, whatever you want to call them. Ainur's the Tolkien word for them. They're like the choir of the creation song. So it's like Eru is essentially like a choir director, and they sing the song. It's split into like 3 parts in the Eindalindale. In the first part, everything's going smoothly, everybody's singing in harmony. Then in the second part, I believe, is where Melkor, who's the Satan figure, starts to get his own ideas. He's like, I'm better than God. I know the plan better. I know a different plan that would work better. And he starts to introduce discord and things like that. And the third part is where, I'm trying to remember if it starts with sort of resolving the discord, or if it, starts with, the discord being really prominent, and then it resolves in sort of harmony. But it is exactly that idea of, but I guess it is a question of whether or not, Eru intended for that discord to be there in the first place. I'm not sure. I haven't read it in a little while. But I think that's a good question. I think it's just a bigger theological question of, does God plan for evil things to happen to work into his plan, or does he just adapt evil things to happen to fit his plan?
Yeah, and it's a difficult discussion to figure out. If you think everything is God's plan, then what's the justification for God planning bad things? And it seems like Tolkien's view of that is that it's kind of a combination of, well, if you're going to have free will, then the humans especially have to be able to choose either good or bad. And then God uses the bad decisions in some way long term to create good.
Yes.
Kind of like the Nazis were bad in World War II, but because the Americans and the Allies defeated them, then maybe there was a net good overall, I guess. But that's a hard argument to make. But I think that's essentially what Tolkien seems to be asserting here.
Well, I think it's the argument you have to make, essentially, because if you really believe in free will, then you have to, recognize that, evil things happen because people choose them. But if you also believe that God has a plan, which of course Tolkien did, and that's very clear, in his own theological writings, how do you reconcile those two things? If God allows for evil to happen, is that really part of his plan? And, I think it's a question of, he did not plan for those evil things to happen, right? He was not saying, okay, here's when the Nazis happen, and that's part of my plan. But he's looking at, okay, these people made this choice. What can I do with this to make it fit my plan? I think Tolkien and the author of this book do an admirable job of trying to really articulate that theory, where after kind of Satan character gets involved in this chaotic compromising of the creation song, there's a kind of an argument or a statement about God or Eru already knows what history will look like. This is a quote from the book in 69. But in an act of condescension, he allows his creatures to participate in its achievement as secondary causes. So, meaning they're singing the song, then the Satan character comes in, but Eru, the God figure, is allowing those angelic type characters to create in response to the Satan type character, and I guess the idea is the Satan character could choose not to do bad, but he is always, I guess, fairly consistently doing. Yeah, he's pretty evil.
And so that kind of begs the question: well, was that a specific creation for that purpose? But I think it's an interesting discussion, and then it's also it goes back to a couple of seasons ago when we had this long running argument about the omniscience of God and free will and whether God can know the decisions we're going to make. And if that's the case, and I think it seems like Tolkien's ideas are that it's like God is beyond time, and so he creates everything, gives free will, sets it in motion, but then periodically kind of helps the story along, to get to the right ending ultimately, which I guess is interesting. I don't know, it seems like.
Well, I do just want to point out he seems to agree more with me than with you, of course. And that God is omniscient. I just want to point that out. I'm on Tolkien's side here, and you are not.
Well, I kind of came around to your way of thinking, but I'm not completely convinced. But I think you made a very good argument.
Well, thank you, thank you. Yes, moving on to providence.
Yes. So they're according to the book, and I guess according to Tolkien, the thing is, he makes assertions. I mean, the author of this book, about definitions of what things are without necessarily attributing them to Tolkien. And so I'm trying to figure out, okay, is this just the definition of the terms that we're using, or is this what Tolkien is defining those terms as?
I think generally when he just defines terms, that is like the Roman Catholic use.
But he doesn't
generally
say that.
That is true.
But anyway, what I do like is the organization of the book, because he immediately hits in every time. He kind of gives us, okay, what are we talking about? And so he immediately mentions there are three elements to God's providence: his conservation of the world, his concurrence with secondary wills, and his governance of all that occurs. We'll get into the details of what those three things are. But according to this theory, God sets certain bounds on what creatures can or ought to accomplish. But God also grants his creatures a share in his rule, which would be that concurrence with secondary wills. The conservation of the world is like the creation, and that it continues to exist, because if it's God's creation and he's willing it to exist, and if he gets bored, he's saying, I'm no longer interested in that. So he has, the God's will has to conserve that world and move it forward, and then of course God governs, sets the rules in place and governs what's going to happen in the future. So anyway, so there was a discussion of specifically what we're talking about in Tolkien's writings about providence, which I thought was kind of interesting about. And I always struggle with these, where even like in Genesis or Exodus, the Old Testament. Where there's a pleading to God, and God will change his mind, based upon the pleas of somebody. And I wonder what's the meaning of that in a theory of providence and omniscience and God's plan. Did he plan on, if you do this, then I'll do that, but he already knows what's going to happen, because he already knows what's going to happen in the future.
Well, I think it's the thing, you told a story a while back, it was the father at our local parish gave a homily, I think, during a funeral of some sort, where he was saying, what use is it to pray for somebody who's already died? Surely they would have already died, and it's over and done with. What do our prayers matter?
Right.
And the priest said, well, because God is outside of time. It doesn't matter when the prayers occur in relation to that person's life. It just matters that they happened. And I think it's the same thing of these appeals to God. It's not that God has necessarily already made a decision, in the past, because he's outside of time, but just because that petition happened, that's what matters, and that prayer is what matters to God, and he incorporates that into his plan.
Yeah. All right. Yeah.
I don't know if that was convincing or not.
It's a good explanation. I just struggle with that, because the more involvement God has in the events post creation, the more, in my view, more responsibility he has to make sure that people don't suffer needlessly. And but of course it's human suffering and worldly suffering, so if there's paradise at the end of it, I guess that kind of negates the temporary physical pain and injustice of it all. But Tolkien's theory, according to this author, going on to page 70, there's a quote here that all the evils of pain and cruelty and chaos serve only as triggers to new developments that beautify and enrich God's world, which is a really optimistic way to looking at a very tough world. And you can really get cynical, and you have to have a lot of faith and a just and caring God in order to put a smiley face on all the evils of the world. But that's basically what Tolkien's doing. That the suffering is part of the plan, because through the suffering you get creativity, and then he goes on at the end of that paragraph to say, even tellingly, despite God's special gift of freedom to men, even these will find that their ugliest works result in His glory and in the increase of beauty in the world. And I guess it's a tough math problem. Yeah. To sum up those things. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? First, do you agree with that's what Tolkien's theory is, generally, if you know? And secondly, what are your thoughts on it?
I mean, I do agree with that. I think we can look to like Gollum in The Lord of the Rings as an example of that. Like Gollum is pretty much a horrible, pitiful creature who essentially tries to betray Sam and Frodo at every turn. But in the end, he's the one who destroys the ring. He's the example of corruption and evil and everything that's wrong with the world, of giving in to the power of Sauron and things like that. But he's the one who destroys the ring by accident, of course. Right. But he does destroy it. So I do think that is Tolkien's belief. We get into that a little bit later with sort of the divine acts of chance and things like that. But to sort of wrap my mind around it, especially in a modern world, is it's tough to do, right? Because I do agree that every action does have some sort of place. I don't think every action is ordained by God, of course. I don't believe in what's the term, like special providence, or I don't know what the term for it is, but the idea that God directly influences our lives, and every choice that we make is a result of God's influence. I don't know the exact theological term. I don't agree with that, right? So I don't think it's God saying, here's when we plan for this to happen, but I do think it is the case that you can turn evil things into good things. I don't think it happens 100% of the time, but I do think it's possible for most evil actions to produce some good. That doesn't mean that we should do evil actions in order to produce good. Good actions will produce more good than evil actions. Right. But I do think it is possible to bring good out of evil.
I think that you would disagree then with Tolkien.
I think so.
Because Tolkien, it seems like his view is that, and he was, according to the author, he's committed to the notion that the worst evil is in the end subservient to God's good purpose. Now, the purpose may not be manifest for centuries. We may not know about all these great things that will result from Ivan the Terrible torturing people to death in Russian, the Caucasus or whatever. But and in that game, we're doing much better, I guess. I don't know. Or maybe somebody had a beautiful painting that came out of that. I don't know. It's hard. It's hard. I mean, I love the idea. I think it's a beautiful idea, a beautiful concept. And certainly, from struggling, you seem to have, humans seem to have a better creative output, after or through suffering. And that's an interesting concept too. But I don't know. And some people would say, well, I'm glad I suffered through that, so now I'm a better person, or that type of thing. But there's a lot of suffering that is just, killing and stuff.
Yes.
So it's an end to, some of God's creations, and it's just kind of hard to really believe in that intellectually, and maybe even more so emotionally. Yeah. Say, oh, this is just part of it. But, I think there are people that believe that a lot of bad things happen. They're part of God's greater plan. But it always rubs me the wrong way. I think I mentioned this before. It's like, like if you see a family whose child is lost in the woods, or they, went missing, and then they end up finding the kid the next day or something, and then, the parents are always, of course, very grateful and all that. And they're on TV saying, oh, it's part of God's plan. There's an angel looking out for him and brought him back to us. And I just always feel so bad for those parents that lost their kids. The kid died, was abducted and murdered, because the implication is, well, there wasn't an angel looking out for the other kid. That's what necessarily, because you got to know there's some mother out there thinking, son of a bitch, or worse, So but I respect it, and it makes intellectual sense if there is a if the God's a creator and everything's good, then even the bad has to be good.
I mean, it also might be sort of a bigger idea, not necessarily that it'll become good, but that you can't escape God, right? Like
Yeah.
no matter what you do, God is everything. God is everywhere. Everything has to be part of God's creation. No matter how many evil acts you do, you're never going to 100%, eliminate God, from your life in a way. God will eventually have control over it.
Yeah. And that brings up, it kind of flows into the next subsection, which is the divine foreknowledge and human freedom in Middle Earth. And he quotes a little Leviathan comment of Tolkien to possibly support Tolkien denying God's omniscience in the interest of freedom of free will. But he says it's a somewhat illegible note. It seems like it's like in the margins of something. So I don't know that we should really grasp onto that as some sort of authoritative.
That's what a lot of the stuff in the History of Middle Earth series is.
Is that right?
Well, I mean, not the bulk of it, but a lot of the more interesting things of like, you can see where Tolkien was heading with this stuff is through these illegible notes or partly legible notes that he just scrawls in the margins, here's what I think, because they weren't notes to anybody else but himself. And so it's like, okay, here's me just writing out, what do I believe about this one topic, or what is my plan for the next, part of this book. And so these are important things to look into. There are a lot of these throughout Tolkien's books where he'll just write something in the margins explaining to himself what he really thinks. But yeah, it's hard to tell what exactly is full thought and what is just sort of a fleeting description.
Well, the author's claiming that this isn't just some one-off thing. It's more of a pattern of Tolkien's writings, where he takes a kind of a theory that there's an analogy between the author and the story, and I guess God being the author of the story, and then the characters are in that, but I guess I don't know. It seems like that doesn't seem to support it, but maybe I'm just not articulating it the same way. But he goes into like a chronology that he describes from Tolkien. That there's a chronology that runs as follows. God gives his theme to the powers to perform. As they perform, they each add their own embellishments to the theme. This is the music proper. So I guess this is the angel song. In response to these unforeseen alterations, I guess unforeseen to God, during the music's performance, God brings forth his own alterations, secretly inducing his children and granting free choice to men. So it seems contradictory to think God's omniscient, but he didn't anticipate them, his creations to doing something. But I guess if you set a machine in motion, sometimes you don't know which way it's going to go, I guess.
Yeah.
And of course, it's very complex machines. And then God shows the valor of their achievement as a sort of movie or vision. And then the powers receive limited foreknowledge from that. As the end of it, and then that's how they are able to see, like the kind of the future and these vague, predictions, I guess.
Yeah. So I think it's hard to sort of break this down, but I think what he's really getting at is, okay, so God's plan initially was create. That's the whole plan. Is I'm just going to create. And so he creates the Valar first, the angel powers, and he starts the song. He starts conducting them, and then they each add their own thing. I think it's described, again, it's been a little while, but because each of these angels are sort of like the Greek gods, and they each represent an element or certain, sort of power over something. So, the Ulmo, affects the waters, and Manwe affects the airs in some fashion, and it's sort of, a surprise to Eru in some fashion, but at the same time, not a surprise. He's giving them a sort of free will over the song while it still fits within his general plan. And then he puts in things that they did not expect at all. The powers, the Valar did not expect, and that is humans and elves, Eru's children specifically, this gift of rational life is completely unforeseen to the Valar. And then at the end of all this, he sort of plays back the whole song, all of creation, like he says, like as a movie. And this is the vision that he gives to them. And then from that point on, Eru has complete foreknowledge of everything, while the Valar have only limited foreknowledge.
Okay. And this is where it mentions the ring story, because Frodo had, the story, free will to either, destroy. He's at the cliff in the volcano, the Lord of the Rings movie, and Sam's yelling at him, just destroy it, throw it in the fire, and then he chooses not to. Now, if he chose to, there, of course, would be a different ending of the movie. So it seems like Tolkien's theory is that God had like 4 different versions of the ending of a movie. Like how they have alternate endings. But the ending, all of them end up with the ring being destroyed. Because with the book, Frodo, fails to, spoiler alert, fails to destroy the ring. Then Gollum jumps on him, bites his finger off and takes the ring and destroys them both. And so then, in a theory, that would be God's intervening after Frodo failed. If Frodo would have prevailed, then there's no role for Gollum to inadvertently do a good thing at the end.
Well, it's different. I don't know if you're drawing on the movies or the books there, but it's different between the two. Where in the movies you see Frodo kind of tackle Gollum off of the edge of the cliff, and he falls into the lava and whatever, and Gollum dies and the ring's destroyed. In the books, Frodo's like out for the count. He gets his finger chopped off and he's like laying on the ground or something. Gollum is dancing around with the ring in his hands, and then he slips and he falls. And that's how it ends. So it's even more divine intervention, if that's what you want to call it, in the books.
I like that better.
Yeah.
Yeah, I forgot that. Yeah.
Where it's, it's actually just chance, or so it appears to Sam and Frodo and Gollum, but really that would have been some sort of divine intervention or something. Right. And he uses the word eucatastrophe, which is an important word that Tolkien really likes to use throughout a lot of his stuff. Literally just means good catastrophe. That is just like Greek for good. So it's an accident or some sort of, it's the word catastrophe. Good catastrophe is the best way to describe it, which is I think coined by Tolkien. I've never seen it anywhere else, but I like the word.
Reading it anywhere else.
Yeah.
Well, it's hard to think of an example of a good catastrophe.
Yeah. Well, I guess it plays into, good comes out of bad things.
Right.
Somebody falling into a volcano is generally not a good thing, but if that somebody is Gollum carrying, all of the evil in the world to be destroyed, that is a good thing.
Not for Gollum.
Not for Gollum. Rough end for that guy.
Yeah, that's interesting. All right, so then, the author, I think, maybe belabors a point a little bit, but he goes on, to reassert that, one's failure to follow God's plan can itself be part of that plan, when considered part from a larger perspective. Just like the example we gave, as far as Frodo didn't follow the plan, but then this, the story continues with Gollum stealing the ring and then falling, or whatever you may say, into the pit of volcano. What is it called?
Lava.
Thank you.
I couldn't think of the word lava.
Lost the word. But then there's a reference to like this creation, the subcreation. And there's a reference to the Auli fashioned of the dwarves.
Yes.
What is that about? I don't know that we've ever talked about.
We have not talked about that. So that's an interesting point in Tolkien's works, in that Eru, God, created men and elves.
Yeah.
Those are his two children. Those are the two rational beings that he made. He did not make the dwarves.
Yeah.
Aule wanted to make his own beings similar to the elves and the dwarves. And Aule is like the sort of god of smithing and that sort of thing. Yeah. The forge, essentially. And so he fashions 7 dwarf men and 7 dwarf women. But the thing is, he can't make them fully rational. Like, they only live when his thought is perfectly, formed into them. Like, when he's focused on them, then they can live. And it's because essentially they're a part of him, like in his rationality, in his mind and his soul. But if he stops thinking about them or goes and does something else, then they just lay there completely asleep. Right. And so what he does is he's like, hey, Eru, I know this isn't part of your plan. I messed up. This wasn't on me to try and create life. It didn't work. Can you make them live? Because I love these things and I love them very much. And Eru does say yes, and he gives them life, but only on the condition that this is a whole other thing, but that they wake up after the elves and men, and they're sort of third-rate children, essentially. Because when he created elves and men, he buried them underground, and they were set to wake up at some later point in time, and that's how it goes. And but the dwarves are supposed to wake up later. They're the third children. In a way, they're not really the children of Eru, but they are still fully rational beings, but not created by Eru himself from the get-go.
So this is just another example of an unanticipated creation within the mythology.
Yes.
Like this god figure created this Aule. And Aule creates the dwarves, and then then it gets mixed up, and then all right, I'll go along with that.
Yeah, because we do see a lot of stories about the dwarves doing very good things for the benefit of Middle Earth and for God. We also see them doing some terrible things, but it's that eucatastrophe. It's not intended, but it works for the good.
Yeah. So, I think the bottom line is really the last sentence of this subsection where he says, God, by implication, sees past, present, and future at once, so that a change in the course of our lives takes him no more by surprise than does a bend in a distant river seen from a mountain top.
I like that. I like that a lot.
Analogy. I thought that really speaks well because it's still the same river, and you wouldn't be surprised by the bend in the river, but you don't exactly know how fast it's going to flow and different obstructions and different things within the river. Maybe and you don't know who's traveling on the river necessarily, but you know the path that it's going to take. So
I like that.
Yeah. All right, so then the next discussion is Tolkien the deist. And I guess what is he really talking about as far as being a deist?
So he's
just being like a non-Christian believer in God. Is that what
it's? I think like what he's looking at is a believer in some sort of detached God that doesn't care about humans, that is not active, and of course that would be different than the God of the Bible, who literally sent Jesus and prophets and everything, and that's sort of the criticism here, because like I said in previous episodes, Eru isn't mentioned that much. Unless you really pull from, okay, this act of intervention, what must have been Eru, this accident, this, happenstance, this must have been Eru's doing, but his name really isn't mentioned very much at all.
Right.
It's only in the Silmarillion, not in the Hobbit, not in the Lord of the Rings at all. So the kind of criticism is, well, does Eru really even have sort of a part to play, or is he just a detached, he creates and then he's just done, he doesn't care, or maybe he just watches it like a movie and doesn't care about his creation. And that's sort of the charge that's leveled at him. Like, this can't be, they're the Christian God because it's detached from the world and it's remote.
Yeah. So I was a little confused by this whole discussion, obviously. So he talks about, the author mentions that the God of Eru is a detached, a deistic God in that Middle Earth, but even that remoteness cannot be termed deism in any meaningful sense for several reasons, and he starts going through those on page 76. First, unlike deism in Middle Earth, God's remoteness is undesirable because, though men in the first age might have wished to pray directly to him, they feared to do so, which is an interesting concept. And second, Middle Earth is not a materialist realm in which God just winds up the clock and lets it run, so it's not like a completely disassociated creator, I guess. And that Tolkien explicitly states that the creator did not hold himself aloof from this Middle Earth. He had some sort of interest in it, I guess, and that by creating it and keeping it going, the creator is willing it to continue into being, like I mentioned earlier. If anything is machine-like, it would be Sauron, who is more of a supporter of a machine-like existence as opposed to Eru or the creator. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, because it's the difference between a micromanaging God and a God that allows for free will. Sauron would be the micromanaging. Okay, here's how the machine works. You are just a cog, and this is what you do for the end of time.
Right.
But it's that's not what God would ever do. Just because he's sort of detached. He's inaccessible is a good word, and I like the word he uses there because God is literally separate from the world, and everybody knows that. You can't just go and talk to him and ask for things. You can, like, sort of through the Valar in certain circumstances, but you don't just be like, hey, I want this to happen, make it happen. It's a different sort of thing, to allow for that free will and to allow for things to run its course according to the laws of nature.
Right, which then brings us to the concept of miracles, which is the next subsection, which is certainly God intervening directly into the life of man or the life of his creation, and Tolkien certainly seemed to believe that God can freely intervene in the creation and did. There's a discussion about supernatural, not that it's just because we're all, anybody with a soul would be supernatural, but that the actions of miracles would be supernatural, meaning they're beyond nature, and it'd be a direct intervention from God. And I guess the examples in Tolkien's writings would be, these different intercessions or different actions that were like the turning of fates in his writing, but but with miracles being distinguished from just a mechanism or some sort of plot device or something. It'd be a real action of God to intervene in the events that occur, right?
Yes.
So what are your thoughts on that?
I would agree, and I like what he says Where does he say here that Tolkien compares miracle and eucatastrophe to seeing sunlight through the chink in a wall or a gap in the threads of fate. This idea of a chink or gap through which the light of God pours occurs 3 times in Tolkien, and he goes on from there. Yeah. But the idea of, these are just instances where we can sort of see the plan, or we can see what God has in mind, and this is him, physically present in the world, and this is him doing things. It's not necessarily like you said, like a plot device, or like, him sort of changing the plan in any sort of way. It's us allowing us to see the plan in some fashion by doing something physically, supernatural.
You know what I really liked about this little subsection? It's maybe a little off topic, but he has this quote in here on page 78, in the middle of it. The supernatural religion of Christianity lifted the shadow of fear that lingered over cultures in dread of malicious and arbitrary magical power by its insistence that the good and holy God's sovereign will rules all that happens. Mm-hmm. And I thought that's a really poignant thing to say. And I don't know if that he's got a footnote there. I don't know if it's Tolkien's thoughts or the author's thoughts summarizing, but I just thought that is really, in a nutshell, why atheists. That's really the cause of the sorrow of atheists, mm-hmm. because they must be so fearful of all these bad things that happen in the world without that kind of reassurance that there is some good, spiritual, a good creator that loves us and that there is good in the world. Because if it's just men in a machine, it's got to be really, really sad. Mm-hmm. Don't you think?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I've told this on the podcast before, but I was talking to a friend, several months ago, but we were talking about, what does an atheist have to look to, like, for anything higher? And we're like, well, it has to be like politics. It has to be current events. Yeah. What is the bigger plan? Well, it's, what does this political party have to say? What's their plan for the future? That's the only plan you can look for.
Right.
How miserable would that be if the highest thing is politics, or is,
Well, either that or building stuff, like out of granite, that's going to last, what I'm saying? Like, your name on it or something. Mm-hmm. Like, there's a lot of builders over the centuries that I think kind of self-worshipped and wanted to leave a legacy, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So I think there's some of that, or maybe just fathering a million children. Who was that one guy from America's Got Talent? He was married to Mariah Carey for a while. He's got like,
is it Nick Cannon?
Yeah, Nick Cannon's got all these
like
kids.
A dozen kids or more now. Yeah,
and he's like, well, I just want to have more kids. Yeah.
Good for him, I guess.
So maybe he finds meaning in that, so that's good.
Maybe.
Anyway, so then I think the most interesting part of this chapter is the discussion of the world as a story, which mm-hmm. Which follows the discussion that we just talked about, and where basically that there's Tolkien is views the entire creation as God's story, that he created, like an author would create characters. And when Tolkien's writing, it's almost like there's some sort of divine inspiration with regard to the characters he created. And it's almost like they take a life of their own, I guess. But there is a discussion. I've got some question marks about thing where he's talking about Tolkien's description of the music and the, you have to pronounce it for me. And then there's Iluvatar. Iluvatar as a second theme to combat Melkor's dissonant sabotage. So that's the Satan character.
Yes, Melkor's the Satan character.
And then the most powerful notes from Melkor's chaos serve to supplement it rather than replace it. So basically, the Satan characters, which we kind of mentioned earlier, Satan characters adding these dissonant notes actually makes the song stronger or mm-hmm. better in many ways, which I think is kind of interesting. So what are your thoughts about the world as a story as we start getting into mm-hmm. this?
I mean, I really like this concept very, very much. And this gets into the sub-creation thing, but the idea that sort of everything in the world is part of the same story. Yeah. This is a great quote here. Every bit of history, every grand myth re-narrates the same ultimate theological story. It's all just yes. echoing the music. It's all echoing the creation song. You apply it to Christianity. It's all echoing the Bible in some way. It's all echoing, Jesus. No matter what you do, if you really write a good story, if you're really participating in life, then you are participating in God's plan. You are ultimately, following along with what God had in mind. That's the story of history, and it's the story of all stories that we create.
And any good story, as the author and Tolkien point out, there has to be an element of danger, an element of risk. And it's kind of interesting. He quotes, I guess he's quoting Tolkien, that a perfectly safe story rings false, whether in fiction or reality. You know, if everything goes well, it's a boring story. You know, if the main character doesn't have to overcome some adversity, it's boring. There's a discussion here about Gandalf interceding in the culture of the Shire, I guess really by recruiting Bilbo and then Frodo for these adventures and all this risk and that kind of stuff. Because the hobbits have gotten complacent and they needed to renew their memory of the high and the perilous. And it's like, you know, the hobbits seem to be pretty you know, comfortable. So you know, would you think that's a good thing? And do you think that is similar to the perilous times that people in the United States are soon to face? After
Sounded like a threat.
having been complacent. You know, I mean, we're all complacent about how good it's been for the last couple of decades, and now we're trying. It's all this chaos is being entered into the equation. You know, is that a necessary thing? You know, like they say, you know, like. Hard times make strong men make good times make.
I mean, I think it's
men, and weak men make bad times.
Yeah. Well, his point is, you know, it's right above that paragraph. His denial of the storial aspect of reality is sinful. You know, if you're, you know, because he's saying, you know, if your goal in life is just to sit still and be comfortable, you are ignoring that there is like a war to be fought in the world. You know, that there is some sort of purpose for you. You know, if you're not struggling with anything, then you're doing it wrong. You know, you have to be struggling with something because that is the story of everything. You know, if you have essentially lived in such a way that you have no struggles, then you have lived a non-human life. You have lived in a way that is trying to distance yourself from God's plan or from some sort of, you know, divine power. You know, if everything's going well, that's because you've just distanced yourself from everything that matters.
I tend to agree with you, but I also agree with this next quote on page 81 at the very top. Nobody enjoys a story without conflict, except for the person living it. That's the truth there. And the people in it, and that's a theme, I think, through his writings, certainly as I recall them. You know, because you know, like Bilbo and Frodo and Sam lament that with Gandalf too, and I think Merry and Pippin at times, where they're lamenting that they have to live in such difficult times and had to deal with those things. But of course, if they didn't take action and participate in those risky things, then the world will go south.
Well, it's the quote of Frodo talking to Gandalf in the Mines of Moria. He says, I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had ever happened. Gandalf responds, so do all who live to see such times. All that matters is what we decide to do with the time that is given to us. We can't change with what is given to us. We all we can do is react to it, and what matters is what we do with it. And if we're just running away from it and trying to live and ignoring any sort of conflict, then we're not dealing with it correctly.
Yeah, I think for our next T-shirt, we should use this quote. Nobody enjoys a story without conflict except for the person.
That's a good quote.
That's so good.
That's good.
I just really believe that that's so true. But nobody. Well, I guess a lot of people want a boring life. Like some days I want a boring life. Some days I'm like, I want some action. Let's get some done. Do some crazy stuff. Anyway, then unless you have any other thoughts about that topic, the next general topic is the order of being. And I like this first sentence. Unsurprisingly, for a conservative Catholic and medievalist, Tolkien's is a hierarchical universe.
You struggle with that one.
Both in terms of human political structure, monarchy, and
episcopacy.
Anyway, because he's a conservative Catholic and medievalist, he likes hierarchy.
Yes.
I mean, that's I can't get the quote out because I can't read or speak. But I just thought that was kind of funny because it's true. And I remember having a discussion with somebody, and I think I insulted this person. It was at Rotary. And I mentioned kind of as passing, well, the best Supreme Court judges are Catholic because they've studied their entire life a philosophy of rules. And mass is rules, everything is rules, And so if you're going to be a judge, you should be following the rules.
Which reminds me, I'm glad you pointed that out. I'm taking a historic trials class this semester about historic trials. But the one, do you know the Buck versus Bell case, the eugenics case that said, you can make eugenics laws and require people to be forcibly sterilized back in the 1920s.
Right.
The one Supreme Court, it was an 8-1 decision in favor of, these sterilization laws. The one Supreme Court justice who voted against it was Roman Catholic.
Yeah.
That's because the Catholic Church, I guess it was the 30s, the Catholic Church had come out against eugenics very strongly by that point.
Well, maybe it's not just because of
maybe not just
religion.
because.
Maybe because it's the wrong thing to do.
Yes, exactly.
One of those knuckleheads that thought of it. And that stuff was going on, and I mean, where I'm going to get off on a rant.
Yeah.
But lobotomizing people that were mentally ill, I mean, there were horrors every day. Human experiments on African Americans. I mean, there was crazy stuff going on, and of course, there's crazy stuff going on now too. But hence the vaccines, but I won't go there. I have gone this entire season so far without mentioning the C word.
That's great, Dad. Good job.
Still haven't said the C word. And no, I'm not talking about the other C word. Anyway, so where was that? We're talking about the order of being.
Yes.
What is the order of being? I have to remember.
Yes. Well, I like what he says here. I think his general point is the closer to God's creation something is, the more real it is. This is something that I've never thought about before, but he says, a factory is less real than a tree. Even though they both physically exist in reality and we can touch them and we can see them and we can smell them in the same way that we perceive anything else, the fact that a factory is a subcreation of humans makes it less real than a tree, which is a creation of God.
Yeah. Well, then he goes even further. That Tolkien asserts that an imaginary giant's castle is more real than a non-imaginary robot factory, which I think that's a little bit of a stretch, but the argument is that is still creative. And of course, I think we're all going to agree about the robot factories when it becomes Terminator.
Yeah. Well, I think this is exactly why I don't like a lot of modern art. I think this is explicitly the reason why. I've never been able to place it, besides the fact, I don't know, it's just ugly, but because it's so absent from anything that's real. You look back, anything before really the last 100 or 50 so years, it's landscapes and it's beautiful sculptures of humans and of, beautiful, essentially just describing the natural world as best as possible. Or,
and it's not just landscapes, though. I don't want. It's not just like taking a picture but using paintbrushes. It's an interpretation of reality too.
Yes.
In the sculptures are an interpretation of people doing things or suffering. In some of those marble sculptures, where it looks like they have fine cloth on them.
Or it's just like the super lifelike, people painted, and you can see their expressions and exactly like what's going through their mind just by the painting.
Right.
And you look at everything past that, and it's just about the message. That's exactly the thing, is it's become so much of a subcreation of a subcreation, right? Paintings and sculptures and everything are already subcreations. Those are humans making things, trying to represent the natural world. But then when you get past that, and you're essentially subcreating a subcreation of a subcreation, you're just getting farther and farther and farther from what is actually real.
Yeah.
You're just, these 3 red lines signify struggle. Okay, how is that in any way, shape, or form real? You can put a message behind it, but it's not real.
Yeah, it's theoretical. And I get what you're saying. I think that's some of it. I think you're really more on the target initially, which is it's not beautiful.
Yeah. I mean that too. I mean, it just lacks beauty, but I think a lot of that is because it's so unreal.
Yeah, and I think that's what they're trying to go for, is to be completely detached from reality, and almost detached from God's creation.
It makes me wonder, because we've talked before about natural revelation, looking at the world and realizing there is something good, there is something planned. I think that's part of it. You can't go for so long looking at incredibly beautiful things without thinking, oh, there's some sort of higher power.
Right.
And I think that's a lot of it, why you don't want to make these really beautiful things, because it points you to God eventually, I think.
There's a lot of truth to that. Interesting. All right, moving along. There's another. There's a hierarchy that he talks about. The authority, the existence, authority, and the third one is love. And there's a reference here in the book that I didn't quite get. It was talking about Finrod, for example, tells Andreth that sentient beings are more properly to be loved than non-sentient creatures such as animals and trees. So who's Finrod and who's Andreth, and why are they talking about these things?
That is, I think, a question you've asked every single episode this season.
Oh, Lord.
These are the two people who are having the discussion. One's an elf, one's a human.
Okay. So
about
this is the story.
Yes, this is the very philosophical sort of Socratic dialogue that Tolkien wrote.
I'm just doing this as a podcast device so that we remind the
Yes.
the
Oh, yeah, I'm
listener
sure.
of what the okay, all right, okay. So that's what that was talking about, and that basically is an order in there that the sentient beings have more value, and then it talks about kind of standard garden variety, and what I would consider garden variety, conservation, that we're stewards of the world and other living things, but we can use them appropriately for our own devices, and I think one of the things is that I really latched onto in this is also where he says simplicity becomes baseness without the high and noble. Heroism is meaningless without its defense of the ordinary. And I thought that was really the theme of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. That the real heroic acts aren't just because they fought a dragon or they did this and they did these these quests or whatever. It's because they were defending the ordinary people, from this evil. And further, that the ordinary people didn't even really know it.
Yeah.
And I think that's even more good, or you want to say, or more pure. And that this few people are heroic because they're suffering for the benefit of everybody else and the many. Anyway, so I thought that was
I do like that.
Put it. Yeah. So moving along to, really kind of foreshadowing of my last comment, the natural world and the order of things and where we fit in this stewardship. And it seems like Tolkien really shared the ideas of a lot of World War I veterans, which was machines are bad.
Yeah. No kidding.
Because they had, and I think everybody should, in America, should be taught in elementary school the horrors of World War I, which we never were. I wasn't either. But the loss of the unnecessary loss of human life beyond regular wars and battles was just obscene. And everybody who experienced it seemed to have come away. That's why the United States was so reluctant to get involved in European politics and was so late to get involved in World War II. And there was such a pacifist view of the world not to get into that. It was just a machine of death. And that's where the tanks were first in armored infantry.
All the mustard gas,
Yeah, the chemical weapons and all these great scientific advancements in the murder of people. And so, he has this theme running through there, which is like the orcs and everything else, which is really just forms of the philosophy of machines and lack of human souls, and just kind of grinding away at a form of creation, but it's really destructive creation, destroying all that is good, but doing it in a mechanized, soulless way.
He says, it's good to use creation, but abuse of creation is a very big problem, because it's not just because, we're robbing our neighbor of something he could have had. He uses like the analogy of fruit from like a tree. If you destroy the tree or destroy the fruit before it's ripe, not only are you not like getting that food for your neighbor, but you're also just destroying something in the process of becoming an inherent good. You've just erased it from ever happening. That's a problem in and of itself, and that you're just not allowing things to flourish. That's a problem too.
Yeah, and then it gives examples of stewards. Of course, Denethor, the
Steward of
really
Gondor.
great heroic figure of Lord of the Rings.
That was sarcasm, by the way, in case anyone didn't get that.
Yeah, but he and his family were stewards of Gondor for many years until Aragorn finally woke up and came back and returned to power. But he also mentions a nice little statement by Sam Gamgee about being a little garden. And that's all a man really needs is a small garden. Stewardship over plants and animals, just for that creative enterprise. And then also mentions a reference to Gandalf, who asserts that he is a steward of all these people that he needs to step in the breach, so to speak, to try to protect all the people that are good and in the world. Yeah. So what are your thoughts about the natural world and stewardship and that kind of discussion.
I mean, it's no surprise to anyone who's read anything by Tolkien that he's a big fan of just nature. Just existing in nature is just a good thing. And again, tying back into, what is real and what is good and viewing God through all of that. But just because at some point it's all you need. We talked earlier about, don't be comfortable, don't be complacent. And I think that's different from just, enjoying nature. By enjoying the fruits of the earth and gardening and doing all of these things, even if you aren't fighting great battles, you're still working to create something. You're not being complacent. And so, just enjoying nature and having your own garden, things like that is just because you're just adding something to the world.
Right.
You're changing the world to produce something good. If that's fruit, if that's animals, it's whatever. You're just making something, and just making something is inherently good. And we'll get into that a little bit later.
I have tried my hand at gardening a couple times, and it ends up being weed infested, and I get almost nothing out of it because I don't spend enough time weeding it.
Yes.
And then cultivating it or whatever.
That is true.
Maybe this spring.
I think you've said that every spring.
And I have tried. Not every spring, but
Most springs.
You know what I was thinking this year? Potatoes.
Potatoes, huh?
Because I think all you got to do is put them in the ground.
I think so.
But you have to have the right ones. You have to get things called tubers.
Yes.
Which actually replicate. If you get like the Idaho potatoes from like Walmart, they're not really good for growing new potatoes.
They'll just grow a big stalk and sort of grow.
I think you will get some potatoes, but not like you would with tubers.
Yes. Well, a potato is a tuber. That's just a kind of thing. But
what I'm saying is there's you have to buy the right tuber.
Yes, you have to buy the right one that'll replicate. Because I think if you just put an Idaho potato in the ground, it'll just grow leaves. Because a potato is just a storage organ for a plant. It's just where it keeps all of its sugars and carbs.
Right.
So if you don't get the right one, it's just going to keep storing more sugars and carbs in that one potato and won't make anything new.
I get a super big potato at the end of that.
You might, I guess. I don't know.
I don't know if that's good.
I don't think it is.
It's gonna be like one of those lobsters that's like 150 years old.
Mm.
You don't want to eat those, they say, because it's like not good meat.
Mm.
Although I don't know if I've ever eaten a lobster. No, I have now. I think once.
Science and fairy. Let's get on to the next topic.
What'd you call me? So this is about discussions of science and magic. Mm-hmm. And I was not at all interested in this, although except for the fact that Tolkien was a fan of science fiction, and it discussed the question of, okay, what if there's life on another planet? How does that affect our view of Christianity and those kind of discussions? And I kind of wonder about that. Maybe they have their own Jesus, or maybe they would locate us, or we'd locate them in order to share Jesus with them. They would be like the pre-Christian humans on Earth, maybe.
Yeah.
If they're sentient beings. If they're just virus-like murderous things, they probably won't be interested in
Probably not.
But maybe we can convert them.
Maybe. It'd be a hard task to
what
convert.
They would look like. But anyways, I guess I'm going down a different
Yes,
road.
that is a rabbit hole.
So what are our thoughts about these kind of fairy magic power stuff? And
But this is an interesting thing in Tolkien, because he has a whole essay about this on fairy stories. And essentially what he argues is, fairy tales, myths, whatever you want to call them, what we were talking about earlier, every story eventually points to the story of Jesus. It's a story of redemption. It's the story of the Bible. That's what really all these cultures around the world are getting at. But, fairy in and of itself, and this is getting into subcreation, is a good thing. We're making up stories. We're making up new worlds that are in some ways realer than our own. It's the imaginary giant's castle as opposed to the real robot factory. We're making it something that has a good meaning and is pointing to the truth. That is an inherent good, and we should try to preserve as many of those stories as possible.
Yeah, and he seemed to be of the theory that it's not science but fantasy which keeps the light of truth alive. Those stories and those myths are more important than knowing the science behind photosynthesis. I guess. I mean, although it's probably pretty important.
Probably.
But
especially if you want to grow some potatoes.
I don't know. I don't think I need to know that.
I guess not.
I just need to know which tuber.
Exactly.
So then going on to, I think this is the last section, subsection, subcreation and art, which we've kind of alluded to this entire time, which is really the how the creations of God can create independently of God and be free, but also serve God. And Tolkien was emphatic that fantasy writing, which is really what all his writing was, I guess, except for his translations and all that,
And essays and things, but yeah.
Certainly the Lord of the Rings type stuff was all fantasy, and he did not really consider it escapist in a pejorative sense, because he didn't really want you to escape the world. He wanted this to inspire you in the real world.
Yes. Yeah, because I'm going to read here from page 92. He says, "The beautiful peril of fantasy reminds us that nature is God's world and not ours. Story makers that can depart from nature into imaginary realms are her lovers, not her slaves." So it's this idea of, we're not getting away from reality. In a way, we're getting closer to reality. We're investigating, the root of spirituality and nature and everything like that, acknowledging that it's not our own, that it's something else. It's something else entirely. And I think that's a big element in Tolkien's work. It's a very interesting idea, too. This is my favorite section of the book, and probably my favorite thing about Tolkien just in general, his ideas on subcreation. It's an interesting, very interesting topic.
Well, yeah, because he talks about, I think you just say the fantasy is, in fact, the purest, highest, and most potent form of art. He thinks that's the highest art, which I don't know I've ever heard anybody else say that fantasy fiction writing is the highest form of art.
I mean, I think it's his argument is it's getting to the truth of the matter. It's pulling back the layers of reality and just bringing us to the theological principles that underlie everything. Good fantasy, at least. I'm sure there's bad fantasy out there that is just escapist. But if you're really writing true fantasy according to Tolkien, you're investigating God and you're investigating nature. Because his idea is, I don't mean to cut you off if you're going to summarize this, but because humans are made in the image and likeness of God, and God is the creator. We are not the creator ourselves, but we are sub-creators. That is our role. That is what we are supposed to do. And so if we are sub-creating an entirely, fictional world, that is being in the image and likeness of God as close as we can. Because that is God's rules. He made the whole world, so let's make our own fictional world that will never compare to his, of course, but that is us acting as close as we can to God.
I think that's kind of a revolutionary thought.
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah.
Because it's really counterintuitive that that you would need to tell fake stories in order to get to the truth.
I mean, and I love it. Well, I also like his thoughts on language. He talks about that a little bit on 92, and I've said similar things going off of the image and likeness of God to kind of draw on Tolkien.
I want to show you my 92. I have nothing underlined or circled.
Yeah, that's great.
Really
this is
interested in the linguistics section of it. So share, please.
But he says one of the most potent tools of the sub-creator is the word. Tolkien sees language as intrinsically creative and even magical. And I think I've talked about this on the podcast, but also image and likeness of God. God is outside of space and time, right? And so what language allows us to do is talk about things that are neither in the current space and not in this current time. We're the only animals that can do that. Other animals can communicate with each other, of course, but none of them can say, hey, guess what happened last week? Or, I think I'm going to do this in the future. Or here's this fictional world. Here's this story that doesn't actually exist, that is not grounded in reality, but we can do that. And that's another example of us, image and likeness of God. In a way, we are using our words to separate what we're saying from space and time itself. And so it's this idea of, again, image and likeness of God, and that's what language allows us to do. And I think that's one of the biggest gifts of God to humanity is language.
And it would be consistent with Jesus being called the Word.
Yes, I mean, exactly, yes.
It is the Word that actually lifts people up. All right, so in conclusion,
yes,
the ends of creation. What's the purpose? Chief feature of creation. What does Tolkien think, and do you agree with him?
Well, I think what Tolkien really believes here, I'm going to read from 94, this in turn, he's talking about, us creating things. This in turn makes creation itself beautiful by reflection. God created us because he delights in looking at us as we reflect his own beauty and blessedness. This idea that, we are here to serve God, image and likeness of God, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But by creating, we are adding something new to God's existence that is reflecting God back to him. Yeah. That's what he thinks the ultimate point of creation was to have these intelligent creatures that can make something new that at the same time reflects God's plan.
Yeah, and I thought the analogy of, we're in the story, but we're also the audience of the story. And then the statement 95, the response of the audience is in a way part of the story itself. Mm-hmm. Kind of reminds me of like how stand-up comedians talk about audiences. They feedback or they can make comments, and it kind of takes on a life of its own that wouldn't if you were a stand-up comic. Like they tried to do some stuff online during COVID. I said it.
No, oh no.
But you know that it's just not the same. It's not the same creation, and so in a sense, you know that we're in there's a reference that Tolkien would stated. I guess he stated because there's a footnote there. God created us because He delights in looking at us as we reflect His own beauty and blessedness. So that seems a little narcissistic, but I could see that, you know, that He would take enjoyment in just seeing what His creations would do. But then the creation itself becomes part of the story and also an audience of the story, you know, because we're learning about God through this creation story and et cetera, and kind of feeds on itself.
Yeah, I think it also might be part of the reason why I like blues and jazz music so much, because, you know, so much of it is dependent on the audience. You know, other genres of music, you know, even if it's performed live, it's a set routine. And, you know, it's sometimes they're even lip syncing along to what's, you know, playing behind them for a lot of the bigger artists too. And it's programmed, and here's the dance routine, and here's where you step here. But if you're listening to live blues and live jazz especially, you know, those solos are made up on the spot. You know, it's a lot of it is reacting to the audience. Okay, maybe the audience didn't like this part, or a lot of it's reacting to the other musicians as well, especially. Right. And so it's like that sort of feedback that you don't get in a lot of other genres of music.
That's true.
And like, I mean, there's a lot of beautiful genres of music out there, but you know, not a lot of them have that sort of feedback that blues and jazz inherently have for the solos and things like that.
Kind of creative freedom.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But yeah,
that's a good analogy.
I mean, I love Tolkien's thoughts on subcreation. That's probably my favorite thing about Tolkien.
Fascinating.
Yes. Well, what did you think of the chapter? That was the last section there.
I did like it, and it you know, obviously the discussions about what can God know and free will. It's always interesting, and it's hard for me to come down to a firm conclusion on any of that stuff. Of course, I guess it's unknowable, right? But you know, I kind of feel like I have a responsibility to myself to actually come down on a firm position, but it's difficult. You know, how do we have free will and God knows everything?
Yeah,
the kind of combination of those concepts. And Tolkien does a good job of trying to convince people. Well, and especially like the morality of a creator who allows evil things to happen. That's a big struggle with a lot of people that don't believe in God. Or don't believe in a just God or a Christian God. Is like, well, how does God allow the suffering to occur? And it's a tough argument to make that, well, it's part of you know, well, good things will result eventually from that suffering. And that doesn't seem to follow from it, especially like if some child is murdered in silence, you know, like nobody knows of it.
Yeah.
Well, what good came of that? And that's a tough call, you know, because you know it happens from time to time, you know.
I mean, I guess very bleak outlook, but it is a good, you know, that child probably is with God. You know, that's not a good way to look at it, I don't think, but that is a good that came out of that action. But it's
it's a tough sell because, you know,
because then that's sort of justifying child murder, and I don't think we should murder children. I want to go on the record and say we should not murder children,
because you know you could say, well, yeah, wouldn't have been, you know, the child's eventually going to go to God, assuming that the child is, you know, becomes an adult and is not go to hell, I guess. But well, maybe I don't know. You don't want to argue that. I guess. Because I think it would be better to, you know, instead of murdering the child, to maybe give the kid a ball to play with. You know?
That's a bold stance.
You know,
give a child a toy or kill the child. You know, it's a hard decision.
Well, you know, I killed him, and that was part of God's plan.
Yeah.
And eventually, you know, I could just see a defendant saying, "Eventually, it's all. I'm telling you, it's all part of God's plan. It's a good thing. It's a good thing that I murdered 13 children.
Yeah.
You know, just wait for it. Wait for it. It's coming." So that's tough. But it's a great discussion, and I'm getting a better appreciation from Tolkien's writing and from him as a person.
Yeah.
The more I learn about it.
Yes.
What are your thoughts?
I mean, I've never really liked a philosophy as much as I like Tolkien's philosophy of subcreation. Like, I've never read any other author who's really resonated with me in that sort of way. And I think that's part of the reason why Tolkien's my favorite author. Is, you know, it's not just that he writes a good story, but his whole point is, you know, to make something, no matter what it is, to a certain extent, you know, if it's a good thing, then that is the point of your life. Yeah. If you make something that has a good impact on the world, then you've done it. You've succeeded. You followed God's plan.
And that's the purpose of even doing the work to begin with. You know, that was his purpose to even start it, to complete it, and then you follow through and everything should work out.
And I think that's why Tolkien was such a perfectionist. You know, you read the History of Middle Earth series, it's dozens and dozens of old drafts, and he changes everything, and he was constant, because I mentioned this earlier, but the Silmarillion wasn't published in his lifetime. It was published after his death. He never finished it. It was compiled by his son and released a couple years after his death. You know, it's that idea of, you know, if this is the point of my life is to sub-create, then it has to be perfect in some way. And I think he might have gotten a little too wrapped up into it, you know, making sure the sound of each word that he created, you know, sounded perfect. Yeah. But, you know, it's that idea of, you know, it has to be given to God.
Right. Good talk.
Yes. Do you have any other final thoughts?
No.
Well, this has been Season 5, Episode 4 of Unlimited Opinions. I almost lost the episode number there. You can follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for talking.
I wasn't talking to you. I was talking to the listener.
Oh.